I filled my water bottle and put it in my backpack, right next to my energy drink and my granola bar. I stepped out of my house and breathed in a breath of fresh air. I walked past my truck, walked across my backyard and through the small stretch of woods, and found myself on the old railroad tracks. Not a single train had come through in 5 years, so it left for a great place for a walk. I began walking. It was that perfect time where there was life all around. But it hadn't started to grow to the point where you left the woods with a brand new rash and Lyme's disease. I had walked for about a mile when my cell phone rang. I took it out of my pocket and answered. It was Davey. "Tom, I'm almost there," he said, breathless. I could hear his feet rapidly hit the ground as he jogged. "Did he follow you?" I asked. "I don't think so. I saw him again last night," he replied. "What happened?" I asked. "I was walking home from Stacy's and I saw someone duck into an alleyway. I went over to check it out and there was nobody there. Then, when I was going into the apartment building, I saw him across the street. He was wearing that same damn ski mask. I tried to call the police, but he drove off in that truck of his, before they even picked up." "How many times have you seen him at this point now?" "This is the 4th night in a row. I've been seeing him at least once a month for the past 2 years," he exclaimed. "All right, I'm almost there. I'll talk to you then," I replied. "Okay, sounds good." He hung up. I continued walking as I called Jennifer. "I'm meeting with Davey," I said when she picked up. "You guys are going through with it? This is a bad idea, and illegal, you know," she exclaimed. "I know, Jen, but I don't want Davey dead. That creep will kill him sooner or later, and now with the gun, he at least has a chance of survival." "I'm still not on board," she said. "Well, I'm about to give it to him, whether you like it or not." Jen sighed. "Whatever. Just make sure he doesn't get himself killed." "Okay, I gotta go." "Alright, I'll see you after work," she said, defeated. "Jen, wait." "What?" she asked. "I love you." "I love you too, Eric." She hung up. I met up with Davey after about 5 more minutes of walking. "Eric, why the hell are we meeting in the middle of nowhere?" he angrily yelled. "Because nobody, including him, could follow us, and plus, you don't want anybody seeing this." I reached into my backpack and pulled out the revolver. I gave it to Davey, and he began to observe it. "I've never shot a gun before," he said. "It's easy. Here, I'll show you." I showed him how to load the weapon and how the safety worked. "Try shooting it at that tree. It's easy," I said. "If you say so," Davey responded as he lifted the gun and aimed it at the tree. His arms were trembling slightly. He breathed in and gently pulled the trigger. The gun exploded, sending scraps of metal into Davey's skull and sending him to the ground. I quickly took my backpack off and grabbed the bleach-filled water bottle. I began pouring it on the body, quickly removing all of my fingerprints. I felt something tug on my pant leg and I realized Davey was still kicking. He looked me in the eye, his eyes full of anger and fear. He tried to say something, but he only gurgled. A quick stop made him stop. I took out my phone and called Jennifer. "What do you want, Eric?" she questioned. "I need to tell you something important and private." "Whatever happened to giving Davey the gun?" she asked. He chickened out, I responded. Oh, thank God. He was going to get himself killed, you know? She said. Yeah, he would have been okay. He's not an idiot, you know. Anyways, back to the thing. When you get home from work, meet me at the old railroad tracks past the backyard, okay? Why there? She asked. Davy says he saw the creep last night, and I don't want him listening to us. I responded. Okay, I'll be there after work, she said as she hung up. She wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. That gave me time to bury Davy and the ski mask. The first part of the story happened about 5 years ago, and we finally got answers to it earlier this year. I'm posting it now because more stuff is happening all of a sudden, and I want to give you the full picture. So, my son is 7 years old, and this started when he was around 2. Now, to give you some background on him, he's nonverbal. The only reason I bring this up is because I want you to understand that he doesn't talk. However, when he was 2, he started to say one word. More importantly, a name. That name is Debbie, and he would say it multiple times a day. He would sound really excited when saying it too, like he was greeting someone. He would also look at something in the empty corner of our living room. It was like he was watching someone. It would make him laugh and hold his attention. I figured there were 2 explanations. Either he was seeing a spirit, or it was just his imagination. After all, he was 2 years old. This would keep on for the next 3 years or so. After that, he would still watch something, but he never said Debbie again. I always wondered who Debbie was, but figured I'd never get an answer. Until my mom texted me one day. She had talked to his other grandmother, and finally brought it up to her, because we had recently talked about it and we don't really talk to his dad's side of the family. Anyway, without any context of what my son used to do, my mom simply asked her if she knew anyone in the family named Debbie. Now, keep in mind, my son had never heard that name before he just started saying it one day. We don't have anyone with that name on our side of the family, or any friends of that name. She proceeds to tell my mom that her best friend's name was Deborah. She absolutely loved kids and was really a sweet person. They were extremely close, but unfortunately she died a few years back. I was sent a picture of this woman, so of course I showed my son. His face lit up and he smiled. That was the end of the whole Debbie thing, as far as I know. He hasn't said Debbie since, and there was a big span of time where he stopped paying attention to that corner. We finally knew who Debbie was. However, the reason I'm sharing this with you now is I've started to experience weird things in this house. And my son seems to be seeing something else now too. Only this time, he isn't happy about it. And I'm not sure what to do. I'll update and explain more later, but what are your thoughts on Debbie? Have you ever experienced or seen someone else experience anything similar? Even now, I'm not sure how I feel, but at least it makes sense. It all began when I moved out of state for school. The college of my choice had an incredibly good architectural program that I wanted to get into. There were 2 slight problems before moving. First was getting a job, which didn't prove too difficult in this college town. The second problem, that seemed a little more challenging, was finding an apartment that I could afford. In this town, even a small room off campus wasn't cheap. And by some miracle, I found one listing after seemingly endless hours of checking openings. The ad in question was for a small 2-story house in an adjacent town that was within my price range. Considering how short of time I had before moving in time for the semester, and there was nothing else as cheap, I immediately took the room. I moved into the house with a few possessions I took with me. The owner was a young woman about my age named Michelle. She was a slim-figured woman with a shade of yellow hair that almost looked white. Her eyes were also the bluest of blue I had ever seen in a person. She was a really big help to me while I was moving my things into the house and unpacking. The house was a small, 2-story Italianate-style home sitting on a luscious green lawn. Michelle told me the house had belonged to her grandparents and needed some refurbishing. I thought the house looked beautiful. The style and setting, combined with the right amount of aging, gave the house a picturesque look. It could easily have come straight out of a painting, it was so beautiful. The first detail I noticed of Michelle was her sense of fashion. She was dressed in a dark, reddish-brown sweater and brown scarf to blend with the color of autumn around her and the property. She completed the look with blue skinny jeans and black boots. The other detail I noticed, upon closer inspection, were the slight but recognizable bags under her eyes, which suggested to me she had been suffering from sleep deprivation. I wouldn't have noticed this given how much energy she gave off. She must have been caffeinated to the gills to help me out that day. I didn't say anything to her about it, though. I only had one chance to make a good first impression with my first roommate. We got done moving and she showed me around the house. My room was on the main floor. It was a bare, green-walled, empty room, aside from a bed with a complete headboard, an antique dresser with a mirror attached to it, and an opened walk-in closet. My mind was already planning on how to decorate my room. Then she led me upstairs and informed me that her room was on the second floor. Below the stairs, I noticed a large, framed picture of an old man with a blank, expressionless look on his face. He both seemed to be staring at the camera taking his picture and also staring at me with some unnatural fashion. I asked Michelle who the old man in the photo was. She stared at the picture, also with a wide-eyed, fearful look on her face. She flatly said that it was her grandfather, and quickly turned up the stairs, as if to get away from his unending gaze. Now, as far as the rules go, she didn't have a lot of them. At least, none that were extreme. But she told me one. And actually, it wasn't so much a rule as it was a little warning that made me scratch my head in confusion. I don't really remember doing it, she explained. But people have told me that I tend to make noises late at night, and I tend to go on for a while. I lowered the rent because I feel like it's the least I could do if it bothers you. All I ask is if you hear anything from my room, don't worry about it, and I'll be fine. But if it gets to be too much, I'll understand, and I'll even reimburse you. It was a strange rule, to be sure. Noises? What kind of noises? I then remembered the benefits I had of living here, and thought to myself, maybe it's not a big deal. Maybe she's just a loud moaner during some late-night sessions, and she didn't want to put it into words for me. I didn't press the issue. I thought to myself that I'd just give her privacy. I was thoroughly exhausted after a long day of moving things into the new apartment, but Michelle was a big help. She purchased takeout that night, which she called her move-in special, which consisted of a pizza, some Chinese food, and an order of taquitos. I'd normally prefer something more nutritionally complete, but I wasn't in the mood to debate. My body was ready to devour every carb in sight. I inhaled a little bit of everything, sometimes mixing them to make some unholy abomination of takeout. The taste was funky and greasy, but I downed it all and felt like I could finish up with a pint of ice cream. And with the help of my new roommate, I did. Exhaustion finally hit me like a brick wall, and I finally turned in for the night, resolving to decorate my room in the morning. I was awakened in the night by a sudden rumbling in my insides, and I darted to the bathroom. The mixture of Italian, Chinese, and takeout had not been sitting well, and had turned my colon into a war zone. I exited the bathroom and heard a sound that reverberated throughout the otherwise quiet house. It took me a moment to realize it was screaming. A high-pitched, shrill screaming full of danger and fear that came from the second floor. I realized it was coming from Michelle's room. Forgetting what she told me earlier, I ran upstairs to her room and knocked on the door. Her screaming was all that responded. I tried turning the knob, only to find that it was locked. She kept screaming, and I could hear thrashing and thumping as if she were being thrown around the room. I called 911, and the police cruiser reached my house within minutes of my call. It was one officer who came, and I was struck by how similar he looked to Michelle. Slender body type, bright blonde hair, and blue eyes. He went by Officer Tears, and he was, in fact, Michelle's older brother. He had been on duty that night and happened to be in the area when my emergency call went out. I had gone upstairs with him, and by that time, the screaming had stopped. He knocked on the door, and Michelle opened the door in seconds. "Hey, sis," he greeted with a smile at her drowsy face. "Your roomie said you were screaming, and I thought I'd check on you." "I'm okay, Ben. Thanks for checking." She ended by closing the door. Ben, or Officer Tears, walked back out after filling out a report and was about to enter his vehicle when I stopped him. "What was that?" I asked him. The incident of her screaming and now being okay suddenly was kind of unnerving. "Michelle suffers from night terrors," he said, turning back to me. "She has for a long time now, and it's okay though. They only sound worse than they really are. If it happens again, just call 911 and I'll be over quickly." He drove off in his cruiser. I had walked back inside, feeling weird about that night. I wondered to myself if this was the noise Michelle was talking about. I saw her again the following morning. She looked more upbeat than I was expecting her to be. She was once again dressed in a fashionable sweater and jeans for her day. I asked her about the previous night, and she looked dumbfounded. I reminded her about her screaming, and her cheerful smile had gravitated downward. "I'm sorry," she said in a sad tone. "I don't really remember what happens, but everyone tells me I have night terrors. I guess I've had them since I was a kid. I'm sorry about last night, but it's really nothing to worry about. They don't last long, and I wake up fine. If you want to leave, though, I understand." I felt sorry for her that moment. I told her it's okay, as long as she's not hurting herself. Besides, where else could I go? I stayed there for 2 weeks. Every night, she had her screaming episodes. They would always occur between midnight and 3 a.m., going off and on with intervals. Just as I think she finally stopped and could go back to sleep, she starts up again. I could hear her screaming during the night since her bedroom is right above mine. Sometimes I'd hear her walk around the room and thrash against a wall or furniture as if she were sleepwalking. I wouldn't be able to sleep during this whole time because the noise was so gut-wrenching that I could never ignore it. During the morning, she would look so positive and chipper on her way to her classes, and I feel like I didn't sleep a wink at all. She'd be out with her cheeriness, and I started feeling a resentment for her. I started looking for changes in my schedule to find some relief. I tried looking for night classes and night shifts. I had to look for anything so that I wouldn't be at home during the night and hear Michelle screaming. I found a position as an overnight stalker at a major retail company. I also managed to get classes for the morning. I never saw Michelle much, but I was glad to not hear her night terrors anymore. It was on the rare instance when I did see her, and I would notice something else. I went to the bathroom one night and saw Michelle standing in front of the mirror. This was the first time I saw her without a sweater and jeans. That time, she wore a pink top and matching shorts. The skin of her exposed upper back showed signs of scarring and bruising. Her arms were also covered in bruises. I think I even saw traces of bite marks on her. The second time I was home, I was checking her room upstairs. The room, which was open at the time, wasn't out of the ordinary. Some posters, a makeup table, and a bed filled the room. And then, the room suddenly felt cold and sinister, as if some unseen figure were inside and dared me to enter. I never walked away from an empty room so fast in my life. It was my day off from classes and no work that night when I was home. I would finally understand the story behind Michelle's night terrors. I came home after running some errands and was ready to drop when I noticed a bright silver sedan in the driveway that I didn't recognize. I walked inside to see Michelle, her brother Ben, and two others I didn't recognize, carrying rolls of some sort of insulation material. Michelle introduced the two older people as her parents, and they were over to help soundproof her bedroom. Her parents greeted me instantly with cheerful smiles and somewhat tired looks on their faces. I felt bad that I didn't help them set up the material, but I had no more energy for even the smallest chore, and I wasn't comfortable going back to that room anymore. After my quick nap, I found everyone still downstairs. Michelle was going for takeout and wanted to know what I wanted. She left and I got to know her parents more. I had asked why they were soundproofing the room. They told me Michelle had noticed that I had changed my schedule so that I could avoid her sleeping patterns and get some rest. She had felt so guilty because she really thought of me as a friend and wanted to make some accommodations for me. Then they told me about the origin of her nightly episodes. It was one day when Michelle was 4 years old. The family was visiting her grandfather, whose mental health had been declining after the death of his wife. Whenever they talked to him, he would say little, if anything, and have a blank look on his face. They had noticed, however, that when he looked at little Michelle, his expression would change in a way that they could only describe as odd. They had spent the night at the house, thinking nothing of his behavior that evening. Later in the night, the parents heard a blood-curdling scream from Michelle's room. They darted to the room and found an obscured figure looming over her and wielding a large kitchen knife in his hand. The father had grabbed a lamp in the room and smashed it over the assailant's head. They switched on the overhead lights and found that the intruder was the grandfather, who still held the knife in his hands. The impact of the blow had killed him instantly. Though she was physically uninjured, Michelle's young mind could not process the event that had happened. What resulted was years and years of night terrors in which Michelle would scream her lungs out. It also wasn't unusual for her to throw herself around the room and sustain some kind of injuries. I had felt worse than ever after hearing about her tragic origin story. I complained about how her screams were keeping me up at night, but she was the one who had gone through a traumatizing incident. I think I would be more surprised if she weren't having night terrors. I thought about what he may have been planning to do, and the thought made me shudder. Since I was off that night, it was one of the rare nights that I was home and was able to fall asleep instantly. The soundproofing must have done the trick, because I don't recall hearing Michelle scream at all. I think I would have preferred that to what came next. I had a vivid nightmare that night that I still recall with clear detail. I was in Michelle's room, and I had been screaming in the silent darkness in my room. I was afraid no one would hear me and not come to help, despite how loud I projected my wails. Above me was a dark silhouette of a person, whose face gradually came into detail. It was the face of an older man, wide-eyed and a large grin splitting his face. He was what I was screaming at. I saw him throw me to the window and my body broke through the glass pane and shards surrounded me as I fell outside and fell to the pavement. I woke up to the sound of shattered glass outside and a large thud just outside my window. I rushed over and saw the bruised and still body of Michelle on the driveway. She was motionless, and a pool of blood began to form around her head. I was horrified by what looked like a suicide, when I heard a laughing above me. I turned my head upwards to Michelle's shattered bedroom window, and my heart had dropped. The same grinning, insane man from my nightmare was leaning over the shattered window with a glee on his face. I was sure he was looking at me before he had disappeared. He had seemed so familiar. I'd called 911 just like before, and once again, Ben pulled up to the house in his police cruiser. He stood frozen while looking at the lifeless cadaver that had once been his younger sister. An ambulance appeared behind him and took his sister away. They didn't switch on the siren and lights. No point to it, as it was too late. This time, Ben wasn't alone on patrol tonight, and they both grilled me about what had happened. I think they were trying to pin me to her death, as if I had killed her. I wanted to tell the truth, but what was I going to tell them? That some psychotic old man had thrown her out the window and literally vanished before my eyes? If I said that, forget jail, I'd go to the psychiatric unit. I told them I don't know what had happened. I just woke up and found her dead outside my window. I think Ben really vouched for me and ruled that his sister's death was an accidental suicide. I was turning back around and past the stairs when my body suddenly froze. My body was reacting to a very sudden, dreadful realization. I was once again looking at the picture of Michelle's grandfather. His flat expression ever staring into me. My heart had suddenly dropped and my blood seemed to have frozen in my veins. It was him in my dream. It was him grinning from the window before he evaporated like steam. I packed up the next day, quit my job, and dropped out of my school and went back home. I wanted to go anywhere I could just to get away from that house. I never went back there. And I want to say that things got better for me after that. But that's not how my story ends. Whatever that thing was had followed me back to my house. Sometimes I'd be asleep or awake, and I'd see that insane grinning man hovering above me. And then I would be the one screaming. I loved her. She was everything to me, and I can't live without her. Ever. She is beautiful to me. Even now. I walk to my friend's house. It's a short walk. I only live a few houses down. I knock on the door and wait. Nobody answers. I hear her dog barking on the other side. I know she's home. We're going to the concert tonight. What could she be doing? I let myself in. She gave me a key about a year ago. "Shelby, it's me, Brittany," I yell. Nothing. I walk up the stairs. I still don't see her. "Shelby, this isn't funny." I get worried. Where is she? I walk to her room. "Shelb, we've got to go." I angrily shout and open the door. I quickly shut it, then open it slowly. Is that real? Am I dreaming? There she is, dead on the floor. I run to her and go check for a pulse. My fingers slip inside her warm, gushy throat. She had slit her own throat, the knife barely in her hand. Oh God. I knew she had some problems, but she never said that they were this bad. If only she had talked to me, I would have been there for her. Sorrow quickly turns to panic. What am I going to do? Who do I call? She has no one but me. Only me. Nobody knows but me. I calm down and think. She can finally be mine. There is blood everywhere, I shout to her body. I go downstairs to get a rag and bucket. We gotta clean this up. I get back to her. She is still perfect. I pick her up by her arms and struggle to drag her to the bathroom. Now, to get you in the tub, I cheerfully giggle. I remove her clothes and throw them aside. It takes a few minutes to get her inside the tub. Her dead weight is almost too much for me. I go back to the rag and bucket and start cleaning the blood off the floor. It takes hours, and I still need something to get the stain out of the carpet. I go back to the bathroom and I turn on the shower head. I run the water over her body. Blood flows down her chest. It's kind of chunky because of the coagulation. I rinse her hair, getting the sticky blood out of it. I've always loved your hair, I said to her. I put shampoo in my hands and rub it into her scalp. After her bath, I lay her on the bed. We'll get you dressed in a minute, I assure her. I look at her on the bed. All I see is the giant gash in her neck. This simply won't do. I find some thick yarn and a needle. I sew her neck shut the best I can and feel satisfied with myself. I walk over to her closet and pick out my favorite dress. I really like this one on you. I smile and walk back to the bed. It almost feels as though she is smiling back. I remember the first time I saw her in this dress. She was going to dinner with some guy that would never appreciate her as I do. I wrestle with her to get it on. Come on now, you gotta help me a little, I say, sitting her up. She falls back over. That was 15 years ago now. I moved into her apartment with her shortly after that. I kept the apartment paid for and called her work to inform them she quit. No one knew she was with me. Dead. The smell, you ask? Well, I looked into the embalming process. I even became a mortician to cover up my purchases. It was all going well, until now. Until I got cancer. Who will take care of my love now? When I'm gone. My only solace is knowing we'll be together in the afterlife. The beam from my flash illuminated the long dark hallway before me. Specks of dust drifted in and out of the light as I slowly scanned the dark environment. After a few moments, the faint pitter-patter of footsteps echoed through the very same hall, until it was revealed to me that the footsteps were approaching from behind me. Turning around, I saw the jolly expression on my friend's face as he was still pulling the zipper up on his jeans. I hope you went outside. I spoke, feeling like he had taken a suspiciously little amount of time to relieve himself. He smiled back at me and simply asked if I was ready to keep exploring. I nodded before turning away from him. Normally, I opt to go urban exploring alone. There can be safety in numbers, but more people are also things I have to keep an eye on. But this particular building, Vickersons Hospital, was halfway between me and Thomas, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to bring him along. He had always expressed a desire to come with me, and it seemed like an easy enough building. The place was run down. Parts of the ceiling had fallen in and were laying in the middle of the hallway. Doors were torn off hinges, laying against the wall, or just missing entirely. Whatever traces of wallpaper or interior decoration there had been was gone. It was an old hospital building that had since been taken back by nature. I remember hearing rumors that the building was an institution that would experiment on different mental disabilities. As we walked through the halls, casting out lights into one room after another, we failed to find anything that was indicative of that. Nothing reminiscent of other equipment I had found in buildings that did relate to mental illness. It was just a run-of-the-mill hospital. Old and torn hospital beds sat in rooms, surrounded by brown, decaying privacy curtains. Seemed like we couldn't walk 5 feet without seeing a cluster of moss climbing to the ceiling. We must have been in there for a little over an hour, when I could tell the appeal was starting to wear off on Thomas. He asked me how long I normally stay, and I replied that it depended on the building, a few hours normally. He started walking slower and looking around less. I figured we could just head out and I would come back at a later date. As I was turning to face him, my flashlight shot down the hall, and for a moment, I thought I saw something retreating into one of the rooms. Keeping the light still, my friend started to turn where I was staring. With a whisper, he asked if I was okay, as I must have frozen up pretty quickly. "Thought I saw someone," I replied in a hushed tone. The building was quiet, apart from the chirping of a few nocturnal insects. If someone was moving around, we would be able to hear it. There was so much rubble on the floors it would be hard to avoid scraping bits of concrete together. It wouldn't be alarmingly uncommon for us to have run into another person exploring the building. It was a nice cool night for it. Still, I didn't feel like I wanted to take any chances. There were a few ways to exit the hospital, so I nudged my friend and slowly we retreated. We tried moving cautiously to reduce the noise we made, but, like I said, it was hard to avoid shuffling the debris around. I kept bouncing the beam of light from in front of me to where I had seen the figure, until we were far enough away from the room that I could hardly make out the door. For a moment, I thought it possible that my eyes had just played a trick on me. That was until, right within the illumination of my flashlight, I saw a person walking into another room. Thomas must have seen it too, as both our feet scraped the floor under us. In tandem, we decided to turn around, and as we did, almost on cue, another shade quickly ducked into an open room. Thomas let out a gasp of air, and I could hear his breathing start to get heavy as he turned to me for guidance, though I wasn't sure of the best course of action. I did start carrying a hatchet with me for self-defense, just in case, so I quickly reached into the bag, but my fingers failed to land on the weapon. I cursed myself, thinking that I hadn't packed it, but that opinion quickly changed as I heard metal crashing to the floor. Spinning to where the noise came from, I could see the light reflection of the shiny metal surface of my hatchet. In disbelief and foolishly, I stepped over to it, telling Thomas to wait where he was. Kneeling down, I wrapped my fingers around the handle and could feel that even in the chilled air, the handle was cold. Lifting myself up, I started walking back to Thomas. But as I did, I could see a head poking out of one of the rooms between us. Thomas could see it too. The thing was looking in his direction. All I could see was dark and matted clumps of hair hanging down. Thomas's face, though, was twisted into something abstract. A fear I had never seen him wear before. An expression so telling that I could feel it in my chest. "Hey!" I screamed. Couldn't tell you why, but I thought it would be better if the thing was focusing on me. I should have taken the opportunity to strike it, but I thought if it was just some squatter, I could scare it or something. Show it I had a weapon. The thing twisted its head to face me within the fraction of time it took me to blink. I quickly understood the expression that Thomas had on his face. "We have to run!" Thomas cried, his voice cracking. I couldn't pull my eyes away from the thing in front of me. The watch-brown, leathery skin was hanging off its face like an old ripped-up sofa, some threads barely hanging on. Under the bits where skin was peeling off was another layer, dark like soot and cracking like burnt tree bark. That dark skin cracked more as the creature clicked its teeth together, almost like it was trying to communicate. I heard Thomas's voice again, the same words repeated, "We have to run!" But this time, it was that creature's lips that were moving with the words. Flakes of darkness falling off around its mouth and loose skin flapped around. Fingers completely free of the external layer of skin. Just burnt black fingers with bone-white nails that were so sharp my hatchet couldn't compete. "Hey!" The exclamation made my skin shiver and bones rattle. It came from behind me, trying to get my attention. My own voice was calling out to me, except it was off. There was a whistle too, like the thing's throat couldn't completely replicate my voice. No matter what, another one of those things was behind me. "Run," I mouthed to Thomas, who didn't have anything behind him. Without so much as a word, he turned and started sprinting down the hall. The creature in front of me leapt out of the hospital room after him. That tan skin was all over, hanging off the thing's frame, held in place by the loose-fitting clothing over a nearly skeletal stature. The thing moved quickly, and I couldn't have caught up with it if I tried. Regardless, I started my run. Looking back just a moment, I could see the other creature exiting the room. This one had shorter blonde hair that really stuck out against the dark scalp. Its clothing was different, along with the color of the skin hanging off of it. It looked as if the creatures were using the skin as a cover, but it had decayed beyond its usefulness. I didn't have the time to sit and try to understand it though. The fear bubbling up like magma urged me to run, and run I did. Feet pounded against the ground. I could hear hard thuds cascading through walls as I pumped my arms and tried to regulate my breathing. If you're going to be urban exploring, it's best to try and stay in shape, and luckily I had been doing it for a while. Though I could hear the skittering behind me closing in quickly. There was no way I was going to be able to outrun the thing. As I descended the stairs, I got another look at the thing's whole body. Long, inky, dark limbs reached in and grabbed the surroundings like a spider clinging to the wall. "Hey!" It screeched again, attempting to perfect my voice. It was closer than last time. Getting to the bottom floor, I had something of a plan, though it wasn't a very good one. I bolted down the hallway as fast as I could, and when I heard the tapping of its fingernails closing in on me, I stopped altogether. Swinging my body around, I used my turning momentum and plunged the hatchet into the side of the creature's head. It didn't seem like it even hurt the thing, but it did stop. It repeated, extending the words until it sounded like the low groan of a motor. The exit was close though, and Lord knows I wasn't going to reach for the hatchet. So I took its halted advance and ran for the exit. A familiar tapping followed after me, but once I had passed the threshold and nearly fell to the grass surrounding the building, I looked back to see the thing had stopped just shy of the doorway. It looked out at me, tilting its head at me, observing me with bright amber eyes. It was then that I remembered Thomas. Shining my light, I scoured the entirety of the outside. Time went on, and I couldn't find anything. Every time I got to another exit to see if he was waiting there for me, I would see the creature sitting in the doorway. Like it thought I was just going to walk up to it and let it take me. Pain lumped in my throat as the sky started to grow brighter, and I eventually had to give up. Screaming until my throat went hoarse, I had to admit defeat and started walking away from the building, hoping that Thomas had just run home, but knowing how unlikely that was. Before long, missing person posters started appearing stapled to poles and taped to windows. I tried my best to help, even telling them where we had gone, even if it did put me at suspicion for foul play. I told them all about the night, except the creatures that attacked me became regular people with ill intentions when I told the police. I figured telling them about the creatures would cast doubt on me. They continued questioning me. Didn't book me, but were certainly keeping an eye on me, which made processing everything all the more difficult. Then, one night, I heard my name being called. It was late. The moon was hanging above, and I was just laying on my back in bed watching the time pass. "Adam!" I heard chime through the silence of my room. At first, I thought it was my imagination. "Adam!" I heard again. Springing up from the bed, I recognized Thomas's voice and ran over to the window to look out into the alley where he was calling me. My heart felt as though it had been ripped to shreds when I looked out the window. "Adam!" He was calling for me, but it wasn't the way you'd yell at someone just to get their attention. The more I heard it, the more clear it became. It was the way you'd yell for someone, desperate that they'd find you and help you. Tears plumed under my eyes, looking into Thomas's face. The skin was stretching and pinned by wire to keep it in place. "Please, Adam!" The thing chimed, unaware of what those words meant. Thomas's clothing hung loosely off its frame, though the skin was pulled taut to be able to fit the thin, elongated frame. It seemed undamaged, from what I could see through the window into the dark anyways. "We have to run!" It cried out. My fingernails were about ready to pry free of my hands as I dug them into the windowsill, clenching my teeth. I want to kill those things. Bury much more than a small ace into their heads. Over and over. As my rage was boiling, it kept calling out my name, and I could hear the sadness and fear in Thomas's voice. And then one of the neighbors turned their back porch light on. The thing quickly moved its head away from the light before fleeing on all fours, moving like a bug. At least I knew where it was going. The house first appeared 2 months ago, after a nearby orphanage burned down. I'm not sure if the two events are related, but I don't think that knowing that would really change anything. The house shows up at the top of Moon Hill, which is the only hill in town, located on the west side past the empty fields. There isn't really much over there. The fields were once used for farming years ago, but they've been empty for the past few decades except for the overgrown weeds and grass. The house looks innocent enough, and if you were driving by, you would think it was just a nice house, located on a hill with a perfect view of the whole town. But it's much more than that. It's a brick colonial-style home with 3 stories. It's not very large and doesn't even take up the entire top of the hill. There are 5 windows on each floor of the house except for the first floor, which only contains 2 windows on either side of the front door. There are no windows on the sides or back of the house. It has 3 brick steps that lead up to the white door, with black iron railings on either side of the steps. The windows were always covered with thick black curtains, and had I never seen anyone step out of the house, I would think it were empty. I noticed it the first time it appeared at around midnight 2 months ago, but I have no idea how long it was there before I happened to notice it. I was sitting at my desk in my bedroom, which just so happens to be facing the fields and Moon Hill. I looked up at the night sky as I waited for sleep to finally come. That's when I noticed the silhouette of the house as the moon was shining behind it. I thought I was dreaming at first, or imagining things at the very least. But then the porch light turned on and I watched, squinting in the dark as a single file line of people came out of the house. They marched down Moon Hill, silently, and through the fields straight into town. I lost sight of them after that since there were no lights to show me where they were, and so I decided to get into bed. As I was laying down, getting ready to close my eyes, the screaming started. It was only one or two distant voices at first, and I thought it might be random, but within seconds the screaming got louder, and it was clear that it was coming from multiple people. I sat up once again and walked back to the window, looking down and trying to spot the source or the location of the screaming, but I couldn't see anything. The screaming continued to slowly sweep through town until I could tell that some of the voices were coming from inside the apartment building. I made my way to the front door and pressed my ear against it as the voices continued to get louder and closer, until I could hear my neighbor across the hall screaming, and then, almost as soon as it started, the screaming stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence fell upon the entire town. I listened intently to the silence, trying to pick up on something, anything that might clue me in as to what was going on. But I couldn't hear anything at all. I slowly tiptoed back to the window and looked out into the night, just in time to see the single file line walk out of the town and back into the house. The porch light turned off and everything was still. The next morning, there were dead people everywhere. Homeless people who slept in the park were dead. People who had been out on the street during that time of night were dead, as were people who had been simply sitting outside their homes or apartments. All of the bodies were found the same way. Gray. Laying on the ground, staring up at the sky with wide eyes, and drained of blood. It took a while for the bodies to be cleaned up, but afterward we were told that there were over 50 of them. Officer Murphy's wife was going around town saying that vampires were the cause of death, and that her husband had told her that all of the bodies had 2 small puncture wounds in the necks. Even though that sounded ridiculous, the rumor spread fast, and people were scrambling to buy random items that they thought would keep the vampires away. Apparently, no one else had noticed the house appear on Moon Hill, and so the general consensus was that there was a vampire in town. It became chaotic as people tried to guess who it was. I didn't tell anyone about the house until the second time it showed up, at the end of that same month. It turns out that the second time, a group of teenagers who were camping in the woods had also noticed the house appear, and the people who came out of it and headed into town. That time, the death toll was almost double what it was the first time. A couple of officers headed up to Moon Hill to check out the area, but found no evidence that a house had ever been there. And everyone stopped talking about the mysterious house, until the third time it showed up. One of the officers who worked on the night shift had driven out to the fields to meet up with his mistress, and happened to notice when the house appeared that night. He was able to notify the other officers of what he saw before they got to him and his mistress. And a couple of minutes later, the entire town was filled with the sound of sirens as police cars raced towards the west side of town to confront whoever it was coming out of the house. That night was loud, filled with the sounds of gunshots and screaming, and by the time the people returned to the house, all of the officers were dead. On the plus side, they didn't make it all the way through town that time. After that, we all got an alert, telling us to stay indoors and away from windows whenever the house appeared. It worked, and the fourth time that the house appeared, The only deaths were those of the few teens who thought it would be cool to sneak out and see the vampire people that were coming out of the house on Moon Hill. That's what everyone was calling them now. The vampire people. I felt like something else was going on, although I had absolutely no idea what it could be. The 5th time the house was set to appear, I had a plan ready. A couple of minutes before midnight, I drove out to Moon Hill and parked behind it. I turned off my car and waited for the house to appear. Once it did, I waited for the porch light to turn on. And then I waited for the people to walk outside and towards the town. Once they were past the fields, I got out of my car and made my way up the hill and around to the front of the house. To my surprise, the front door was unlocked, and despite the fact that my brain was practically screaming at me to not go in, I opened the door and stepped into the house. The front door opened to a foyer, with wooden floors and a giant staircase that led upstairs into darkness. There were 2 doors, one to the left of the foyer and one to the right. I decided to open the door on the left first and walked into a giant room that was empty, except for a broken chandelier that hung in the middle of the ceiling. I walked out of the room and closed the door behind me, and then walked to the door on the right and opened it to find the same. Another empty room, except this one had a fireplace instead of a chandelier. I finally decided to make my way upstairs and quickly walked up the staircase as I could hear some screaming now. I got to the 2nd floor to find that it was just one giant room. Only this one wasn't empty. There were large bags hanging from the roof, more than 20 from what I could see. I slowly made my way towards the nearest bag and reached out to touch it. It was extremely cold to the touch. As I moved my hand around, I began to recognize the shape of the thing that I was touching. It was a body. I was groping a dead body. I backed away from the bag and made my way through the rest of the bags, making sure not to touch any more of them. I got to the 2nd staircase and quickly made my way up to the 3rd floor. The screams had begun to die out, which meant that the people would be back at the house soon, and I did not want to be here when that happened. When I got to the last room, I saw more bodies. Only these were inside giant glass containers, floating in some sort of clear liquid. These bodies were also recognizable. They were the same people who had been attacked and killed in town during the past few weeks. Each container was numbered, and there were 5 of them toward the back of the room that were still empty. I estimated that there were maybe 60 or so containers in this room alone, meaning that the rest of the bodies had to be on the 2nd floor, still in the body bags. More confused now than ever, I raced back down the stairs and ran out of the front door. When I got outside, I could see the line of people headed back toward the house. I didn't want to risk being seen running back to my car, and so I crouched by the side of the house and watched as the people walked back into the house in silence. I counted over 20 people, most of them children. And for a second, the thought that these were somehow the same kids from the orphanage that burned down crossed my mind. When the last person went into the house, I ran back to my car and got inside, locking the doors. I sat in silence and waited for a few minutes for the house to disappear once again. Once it was gone, I drove back home, passing by exactly 5 dead bodies. I didn't think I would sleep that night, but I ended up passing out eventually. The next morning, I found my bedroom window open and a letter on my desk.
Dear Celine, sorry that we missed your visit last night. I'm sorry to say that we have moved on to a different town now, as we've got everything that we came for. You must be alarmed by what you saw, and I honestly don't blame you. It would be an odd situation to walk into for anyone, I would, however, like it if you joined us. I have included the location of our next town. Come, if you'd like. Sincerely, the vampire people.
Don't look behind you. You now want to look behind you, I know it. It's instinctual, like thinking about pink elephants when you're told not to. Maybe you already did it, and maybe you chuckled at being so silly and turning around. That will only make what's about to happen even worse for you. I'm sorry about doing this, but I just want to survive. I have a kid, a husband. I love my life. I bet you have people who love you too. I'm very sorry about doing this. Listen to me, please. Don't look back. It's lurking, close to you now. So close. Can you hear that? It's almost imperceptible now. But it won't be for long. I bet you can notice something moving closer. I sent it to you. Offered it a new victim. This story is a trap. And you've fallen for it. Now, it knows you're out there. Running won't help. I've tried it before. I barely survived that experience. Let me give you a piece of advice. It's the least I can do, now that I've doomed you to a hellish experience. For no reason in the world, allow the lights to go off. Keep them on, at all times. During the night, during the day, it doesn't matter. Keep your cell phone handy, in case it makes sure the lamps in your apartment or home stop working. It's clever that way. Devious that way. Don't scream. Screaming makes it hurt you all the worse. But more importantly, don't look directly at it. So, for crying out loud, don't look behind you now. You thought you'd be safe, right? Just another creepy story to spook you in the middle of the night. Nothing but harmless fun. You figured it's like a roller coaster. It pumps you full of adrenaline, but you'll come out without a scratch on you. So, you read the first story and you figured... I looked back, there was nothing but a wall there, or my mom, sister, or any other loved one. That's how I get you. You feel safe, secure. You think I meant that one time you shouldn't look back. But it's not quite so easy, insignificant human. One day, one evening, one night, you'll look behind you, and there I'll be, smirking the cruel smile of the eternal. I'm the reason you can't fall asleep at night whenever you're sure you heard a sound. I'm the reason you feel goosebumps while walking alone in a dark street. You can't see me, but your mind knows I'm there, lurking, waiting, playing with my prey. And the time will come. I'll be there, right behind you when you least expect me to be. And then you'll see me and remember this warning. All too late. Good night, human. Go to sleep. Perhaps I'll be waiting in the morning when you first open your eyes. Hope the thought of me watching you sleep doesn't bring you nightmares. I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading it right. Wanted. Someone to infect me with the COVID-19 virus. Must be verified as sick. Have paperwork verifying illness no older than 2 days from today's date. And be willing to allow me to spend time near you. We'll pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me at... And their email address followed. I had received my paperwork yesterday, but I had been being affected by the virus for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We had all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as the overtime I had been making before the closure. I had been living a little outside my means, and the bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick had ended my job search, and $500 for doing nothing more than letting a stranger into my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me up out of my stupor at around 5:58, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I had expected a weirdo. Maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick. But this guy was surprisingly well put together. He wore black slacks, a button-down shirt, no mask, with close-cropped brown hair and square little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me the 5 crisp $100 bills, and I led him to the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back into the couch and stared at me intently. "So," I asked, "now what do we do?" He shrugged. "Just do whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever you usually do. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes for me to get the disease, and I'll have succeeded in my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" He chuckled. "I'd tell you, but honestly, it would sound crazy." I shrugged. It's not like I have anything else to do but watch Netflix for the next 8 hours. "Tell me. It'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming as though he were looking for something, before getting up and taking a paperback book from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he'd seen, because he smiled and held the book out to me. "I see you are a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want me to, but my books are part of the reason I'm here." I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin, the guy who writes the Ghost Grass series?" He nodded. "Yep, 3-time New York Times bestseller." I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. "Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick?" He smiled, but the smile was sad. "You could say that writing is why I'm here." And then he told me the strangest story I'd ever heard. He sat down again and made himself comfortable. "I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly, a cough and a fever, typical flu-like symptoms. But I assured my agent that it wouldn't be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. The first couple days weren't so bad. I was still lucid and I managed to get some work done, I was trucking right along, making good progress, when the real sickness hit. Suddenly, I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent, and my nights rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or awake. I had these dreams. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on my couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. That sounds pretty bad. It sounds like you didn't get a lot done. Quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the story, the more I started writing about it. Well, not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling it. I would just come to at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I had been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that my incoherent brain couldn't wrap around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of my stories. I was so worried. These stories were weird and completely batty, and I was worried that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had been cooking up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. So, what did she think? Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I would be done with it. Reading through what I sent her and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I can see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things and completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely outside of the normal processes. It seems to contain two antagonists and no hero. A war with nothing but loss, and stakes that didn't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was. Now that's where the problems arose. He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid it across the coffee table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying, after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were quashing the fever, and the fever was what was keeping me in my altered state of mind. I was careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to on my computer as I finished more pages than I've ever done. I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out as long as I could. But eventually, my body started to get better. My fever abated and my fugue states became fewer and fewer. I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and the story wasn't something I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending and wanting a sequel. And that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at that. I know that's what brought you here. That's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this crap. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near-constant fever, I seem to mostly exist in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing it worse than that, too. What if you get it really bad and you're hospitalized? It seems like that could put a damper on your writing." He shrugged. "That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to write. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind. Maybe it's this place that I have tapped into in my fugue state. And I've had this thing 3 times now, If I'd had water at hand, I'd have done a spit take." 3 times? My God. You rarely hear of anyone getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up," he said, suddenly looking far away. "I tried faking it, but it wasn't the same. My agent started to notice. She started to send my stuff back with notes like, 'I need more of the voice you had in your first drafts.' I started getting desperate. She told me she had shared my notes with some of her colleagues. They were very excited about how it would come together. So, I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation." "You needed to get sick again," I said. He nodded. "I needed to get sick again. I started slowly at first, waiting in hospitals and walking around looking for sick people. But I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter at a sick friend's house. One trip to their apartment later, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start." "Did they? Would I still be running the ad if they hadn't?" "Something was different this time, though. This time, I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists' exploits. I saw it. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory, and lose it again. And all the while, I was chronicling them. It became a mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't last long. After a week, my fevers were abating, and I was back to trying to fake it. But I couldn't fake it. I wouldn't even try for long. I needed the dreams. I needed the visions. I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That's when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them. Said it was sick. But once I offered to pay her triple her going rate, she caved. As I watched him talk about it, I reflected that he looked a little sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict describing his favorite drug. He scratched at his arm as he talked, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described the visions. And I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story, had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many times, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little bit less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had it a week. I was so anxious to get some work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages out of the whole week. 30 pages? I gaped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work from a sick person. I know, it's super disgraceful. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time, I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little, and he didn't seem pleased with what he saw as he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy and tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land differently. The fugues allowed me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas, but my puny lizard brain just can't make anything out of it. You know, reading these things that I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. "How much of your book have you written?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. He scratched again, seeming uncomfortable but still wanting to discuss his drug of choice. "I have written 5 books. I have cataloged the lives of these two, from the moment of their births to the very last encounter the two had directly." I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The page volume he talked about per day surely meant these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, and made them even more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them?" He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I almost regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I can learn how it ends. How we end. We? Humanity. We are ultimately the prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of seasons. But they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I didn't really want to know anymore, but now I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence and exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence. He told me about Brandyloo, the servants of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Man. He told me how this green warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour when someone is telling you about the eldritch deities. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his phone, and seemed to realize that he'd been talking all night. I seem to have gone over my time a little. "Here, as promised," he said, taking out an envelope and handing it to me as he made to leave. "Wait," I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily up off the couch. "How does it end?" He looked back and shrugged. "Hopefully I find out. If I do, I'll let you know." Then he left, and I wouldn't hear from him for another 3 months. Well, I'd never see him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week. My fever breaking and my headaches getting better and better. I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty with no barbacks to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs as usual. I enjoyed the work, though it wasn't something I had ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after such a long absence. Then one afternoon, I was helping my new boss open, flipping on the TVs and preparing to tune them to one of the several sports channels we often had on, when I saw a little squib on the news that made me stop.
And the city is mourning the death of local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of COVID-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghost Grass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Services will be held Tuesday for friends and family.
I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent fatigue from being sick. I told him I was fine though and went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he discovered the end he was looking for. I got my answer in the mail 2 months later. A package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from a Samantha Drummond. The delivery address was mine though, so I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript bound with twine with no title across the surface. On top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond, informing me of her package's purpose. Hello. My brother requested that I send this to you if he should pass. He was very adamant that it be placed into your care. All the best. I lifted out the journal, opening the front page bearing a message written in a shaky hand. I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone. I've been sitting here looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure whether I should read it or burn it. If the beings Timothy talked about have been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future. And this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little as I put the journal back into the box and carried it to my room. I've decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown. Envious. That's the word my mother taught me when I talked about my wish to play with the neighborhood kids. Don't be envious. You had your time for games now, and you need to study and help out around the house. But I am envious. I'm jealous. They laugh so loud and they have so much fun. Tag, hide and seek, and just so much running. I've never been good at running. Maybe if I played with them, I'd be faster. Months of their laughter echoing in my dark room as I just watched and learned. Billy, the tallest, liked to hide in the trees. He was a good climber. Sammy was the fastest. She would run the furthest before she hid. James hated trees and bushes, so he liked to just hide behind standing things. Josephine was the smartest. I thought her name was the prettiest. When summer break came, their games ran later and later into the night. Finally, they played one after sunset. Mother said I could go out after sunset. Sammy was counting loudly, eyes closed against the tree. Her voice was drowned out by the sound of my heavy feet. As she finished proclaiming the last few numbers, my hand closed around her throat. She was so small. There was a soft pop in her neck as I watched blood fill her eyes. I'm glad I didn't have to chase her. Billy was where I thought he would be. I didn't even need to jump to reach him. By the time he realized it was my hand pulling him from the tree, the hatches had removed his head. James really needed to work on his hiding spot. The shed was small and he kept peeking out. How wasn't I going to find him? He seemed surprised when the gardening shears came through his chest, lifting him from the ground. Josephine was always my favorite. I'm not surprised I struggled to find her. In the end, I couldn't help but say her name. Josephine. Such a pretty name. Josephine. Crying was coming from under the porch of the abandoned house. Oh, Josephine. So close. Mother says we must move again. I can't believe at 79 she wants to uproot again, but I will help her as I always do. I am just glad I finally got to play before we left. What's the one thing you would think is impossible to lose? If you'd asked me that a year ago, I would have probably given you a funny look for such an odd question. Then, my answer would have been something like my house or my cynicism. So, imagine our collective shock when we lost the ocean. It started with a sudden loss of contact with coastal towns and cities. Ever think about what would happen if the New York stock market just stopped communicating? Connection error. Try again. Hong Kong, Los Angeles, St. Petersburg, Lisbon, countless others. Radio silence. Okay, that's fine. Let's hop in the car and go check it out. And you drive. And you drive. And you drive. The roads start out as expected. Waze directs you as usual. But as the coast comes into view on the screen, the land ahead of you continues with roads no one remembers building. A couple hours pass, and airplanes that had been over the ocean never re-establish contact. Cargo ships? Forget about that international order, bud. Some start to panic. Some immediately start accusing the government for something. They don't know what, but it must be the secret elite. Others say it's a media scam, but they don't want to drive 5 hours to check for themselves, so they'll just continue yelling about it. The rational folk turn to the scientists. What the hell, Doc? What's going on? And we gawk as they say they have no idea. Satellites are still working and show the Earth as expected, 70% water and whatnot. But when they try sending up a new rocket, it just keeps going. The land stretching out infinitely along all horizons, and the sky remains blue. We can still use satellite-based communication, though forget those sea cables. Other continents report the same. Land in sight of the coast has seemingly disappeared, replaced by endless continuation of the land masses. As a first-generation immigrant, it sucked to realize I'd never be able to visit my family again. But I am grateful we never bought that beach house we talked about. We don't know where the people on the coast disappeared to, and the way it's going, I'm not sure we ever will. Not sure how long the internet will last, considering we can't repair or launch new satellites. It's each infinite continent for itself at this point. God, I miss tuna.